The guards found the rifle before they found the woman. AMK-21, precision sniper rifle military grade, suppressor threaded, zeroed for 1,000, 200 meters locked in a hard case, in the trunk of an administrative assistance sedan. Falcon Ridge Naval Station went quiet, the way bases only go quiet when something has gone very wrong. Boots stopped. Radios crackled. 12 security personnel surrounded a 28-year-old woman in a cardigan who didn't blink. She made one phone call. 4 minutes later, a Pentagon-level clearance message hit every terminal on base simultaneously, and the men with rifles lowered them. Nobody knew who she really was. If you're new here, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because it gets so much darker. The morning started the same way every morning. At Falcon Ridge, started with bad coffee, fluorescent lighting, and the low-grade bureaucratic hum of a naval installation that believed its own paperwork mattered. Evelyn Blackwell arrived at 742, same as always. She parked her gray Honda in the east lot, same spot, third row from the fence. Carried a canvas tote bag with a broken strap she'd been meaning to replace for 4 months and a travel mug that had long since stopped keeping anything warm. Her badge was already clipped to her lanyard. She swiped in through the admin building's side entrance without looking up. Security camera above the door caught her the way it caught her every morning, shoulders slightly forward, hair pulled back without care, expression set to neutral, unremarkable, forgettable, exactly what she needed to be. Inside, she took her seat in the administrative pool on the second floor, a long open room divided by chest-height partitions and cluttered with the residue of institutional life. File trays, outdated calendars, a dying succulent someone had brought in 2 years ago and abandoned. Her desk was neat without being conspicuous. No photographs. No personal items beyond a worn coffee ring on the corner of her desk blotter that had been there since October. She logged in. Started with the overnight routing slips. Requisition forms, maintenance reports, personnel scheduling for the weekend duty roster. The work was genuinely boring, and that was the point. Chief Petty Officer Dana Rourke swung by at 800 with a stack of folders and dropped them on the corner of Evelyn's desk without ceremony. Transfer requests. Commander wants them processed before EOD. I'll get to them after the routing slips, he said before noon. Evelyn looked up for exactly 1 second. Then he should have told me yesterday. Rourke hesitated, then walked away. That was usually how it went. Evelyn wasn't difficult, she was precise. There was a difference, though most people at Falcon Ridge had stopped trying to find it. The morning moved. She processed the routing slips, started on the transfer requests, and ate a granola bar at her desk without tasting it. The fluorescent light above her partition flickered 3 times between 900 and 1,100, which was 3 times more than it should have, and nobody fixed it. She'd submitted the maintenance request 6 weeks ago. It was probably on her own desk somewhere, rerouted back to her department by mistake. At 1,130, she packed her bag to head to the vehicle checkpoint for her mid-tour clearance renewal, a routine administrative requirement for personnel with certain base access levels. She'd done it 6 times before. It took 20 minutes. They scanned her badge, checked her vehicle log, and let her go. This time was different. The checkpoint on the eastern perimeter had 2 new security officers, fresh assignment judging by the stiffness in their posture and the way they held their clipboards like shields. The senior of the 2 was young, maybe 24, with sergeant stripes that still looked like they'd been ironed on that morning. His name tape read Carver. Evelyn pulled up, rolled down her window, and handed over her badge and the vehicle registration without being asked. Carver took both, looked at her badge, looked at her. Administrative services? That's right. Purpose of vehicle on base? Standard commute. I'm here for my clearance renewal. He typed something into the handheld terminal, waited, nodded. Routine. She watched him run through the checklist: registration, insurance, base vehicle sticker, and she could see the moment he reached the secondary inspection item. Vehicle search for personnel with Level 3 access renewal. Protocol. She knew it was coming. She popped the trunk before he asked. The second officer, younger, paler, named Tape, Red Delsby walked around to the rear of the car. Evelyn watched him in the side mirror. She heard the trunk lid go up. She heard nothing for 3 seconds. Then, Sergeant Carver. The voice was flat in the way that voices go flat when someone is actively deciding how alarmed to be. Carver walked to the back of the car. Another pause. Then his radio came up. Control, this is Checkpoint Echo. I need a supervisor to my position. This perimeter now. Evelyn turned off the engine. She stayed in the driver's seat while they called it in, while a second vehicle arrived, while 4 more security personnel fanned out around her car with hands near their sidearms. She didn't move, didn't reach for her phone. She sat with her hands visible on the steering wheel, watching the side mirror, and she breathed at 10 counts per cycle, a habit from another life. The supervisor who arrived was a lieutenant, tall, mid-30s, the kind of career officer who had spent enough years at rear installations to be confident in situations he'd never actually trained for. Lieutenant Hess. He came to her window with his hand already resting on his holster. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." She stepped out. In the trunk, in a hard-shell Pelican case with foam cutouts and a 2-point locking system, was a MK-21 PSR, Precision Sniper Rifle, the military's current top-tier long-range platform. Chambered in 0.338 Norma Magnum, capable of effective engagement past 1,500 meters in the right hands. Beside it, a suppressor, 2 spare magazine groups, and a single notebook with range data handwritten. In a compact, controlled script, Hess stared at the case, stared at her, stared at the case again. "That," Evelyn said quietly, before he could speak, "is a personally assigned government asset. The serial number is registered in the DoD Small Arms database under personnel code that you will not have access to at your clearance level." "Who are you?" "My name is on my badge." "That's not what I asked." The people nearby had gone very still. 2 security officers stood slightly behind Carver. Oglesby hadn't moved from the rear of the car. A staff sergeant who'd arrived with the second vehicle was watching from 10 feet back, trying to look casual and failing. Somewhere on the base, the normal morning was continuing. A helicopter was running up on the north pad. Someone was cutting grass near the maintenance yard. But at this checkpoint, everything had contracted to a very small, very tense radius. Hess tried a different angle. Why is a government-assigned weapons system in the personal vehicle of an admin pool employee? Because I needed to transport it. "That's not, Lieutenant." Her voice didn't rise. It just became more exact. "I understand this looks unusual. I'm going to reach into my jacket pocket and retrieve my phone. I'm going to make 1 call. Then I'd like you to be patient for approximately 4 minutes." Hess looked at the rifle case, looked at her hands, made a decision. "Go ahead." The call lasted 40 seconds. She said 3 things: a code sequence, a name, and a location. Then she hung up and stood with her hands at her sides, while Hess and his people watched her, and tried to figure out what kind of situation they were standing in the middle of. The answer came in 3 minutes and 50 seconds. Every terminal in the base's security network received a Priority 1 routing message simultaneously, a secure Pentagon-level transmission that bypassed normal channels and required no local authorization to display. The message confirmed the weapons system in question was a classified asset under ongoing operational assignment, confirmed Evelyn's personnel code, classification level, and status. It instructed checkpoint personnel to return all confiscated items, document nothing beyond a routine inspection notation, and consider the matter closed. It was signed by a flag officer whose name made Hess go slightly pale. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Carver, quietly, closed the trunk. "Ma'am," Hess said, and his voice had changed, not respectful exactly, but recalibrated. Like a man who had just realized the floor was further down than he'd thought. "I apologize for the inconvenience." "You were doing your job," Evelyn said. "Not warm, not cold, just accurate. I'd have done the same." She got back in the car, completed her clearance renewal, and drove to the parking lot. She sat in the car for 60 seconds before going inside. Word travels fast on a small base, and Falcon Ridge was a small base. By 1,400, the administrative pool had developed 4 separate theories about Evelyn Blackwell and the rifle in her trunk, none of which were accurate, and 2 of which were completely absurd. By 1,600, the story had reached the officer's mess in a version that had grown several details it hadn't originally possessed. Evelyn heard exactly none of this. Or rather, she heard all of it in the way that she heard everything on base, filtered through peripheral awareness, cataloged, assessed, and filed. She continued processing transfer requests. She fixed a scheduling error in the weekend duty roster that would have caused a minor crisis on Saturday. She resubmitted the maintenance request for the flickering light, this time routing it through a different department. 1,730. She was the last one in the administrative pool. She liked it that way. She was reviewing a stack of housing allocation forms when she became aware of someone standing at the entrance to her partition. She didn't look up immediately. She logged the presence, assessed the weight and stance from peripheral data, and determined it wasn't a threat before she turned. The man in the doorway was a sergeant. Late 30s, compact build, the kind of physical conditioning that didn't come from a gym program, but from years of actual use. His uniform was correct without being ceremonial. He had a actual coffee, black, in a paper cup that he was holding like he'd forgotten it was there. His name tape read Vale. Blackwell, he said. Sergeant Vale. She turned back to the housing forms. I don't think we've been formally introduced. We haven't. He came in anyway, pulled the chair from the empty desk across the partition, and sat in it backwards without asking permission. Marcus Vale. I'm attached to the Base Security Improvement Project out of naval facilities. I've been here 6 weeks. I know who you are. A slight pause. He adjusted his grip on the coffee cup. Is that right? You were a 317 before you lateraled to facilities. Scout sniper. 2 deployments to Helmand, 1 to Anbar. You separated at E7 and came back as a civilian contractor 3 years later. You run 4 miles every morning and you're left eye dominant, which is why you always sit with your right side toward the door. Vale looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the chair he'd chosen, which did indeed position his right side toward the room's entrance. Huh, he said. What do you want, Sergeant? I heard about the checkpoint thing. He took a drink of his coffee, set the cup on the partition ledge, the rifle, the Pentagon clearance, the whole show. Congratulations. So did everyone. Thing is, he said, most people heard a story about a woman who somehow had a classified weapons system in her car and got it cleared through channels. Nobody on this base has ever seen move that fast. That's what happened. That's not all that happened. He leaned forward slightly. I watched you on the camera footage. Security let me pull it after. You want to know what I saw? She didn't answer. Checkpoint search. 4 armed personnel. A lieutenant who clearly thought he had you cornered. Vale spoke carefully, like he was reading from notes he'd already gone over a few times. And you stood there with your hands at your sides and your heart rate probably at 60. You assessed every person in that group before you spoke. You gave the lieutenant a face-saving option when you could have made him look like an idiot. And when you got back in your car, you sat there for exactly 1 minute before going inside. Evelyn set down the housing form she'd been holding. Why 60 seconds? Vale asked. Old habit. From what? She looked at him. He held the look without flinching, which most people couldn't manage. You're a long way from facilities management, Sergeant. Yeah. He picked up his coffee. I am. The fluorescent light above them flickered twice. Neither of them looked at it. The rifle, Vale said. MK-21. 0.338 Norma. The notebook with the range data I caught a glimpse before they closed the case. The dope was written for environmental variables that don't exist anywhere near this base. Altitude, wind profiles, temperature differentials. He paused. Somebody was writing data for elevations above 5,000 feet. variable crosswinds, cold weather corrections. You have good eyes, Evelyn said. I was trained by people who had better ones. He looked at her steadily. That rifle hasn't been sitting in your trunk because you needed to move it somewhere. Been maintained recently. The action was clean, even from distance. Scope caps were off and replaced. You can see the microabrasions on the housing if you know what to look for. Do you know what to look for? I used to, he said. I was pretty good once. She said nothing. Vale stood, put the chair back where he'd found it, picked up his coffee. He was almost at the partition entrance when he stopped. My instructor at Scout Sniper School, he said, not turning around, used to say that the most dangerous shooter in any room is the one you've already decided isn't a threat. He turned his head slightly. Not enough to look back at her, just enough to acknowledge she was there. I stopped making that mistake a long time ago. He left. Evelyn sat with the housing forms for another few seconds. Then she put them in the completed tray, turned off her desk lamp, and reached under the desk for her canvas bag. Her hand paused on the strap, the broken strap. She'd been meaning to fix it for 4 months. Picked up the bag, shouldered it, and walked to the elevator. She lived 20 minutes off base in a duplex on a county road that's been slowly losing its paving for 3 years. The other half of the duplex belonged to an older woman named Patricia, who kept 3 cats and watched cable news at a volume Evelyn could hear through the shared wall, which had served as useful cover noise on more than one occasion. The duplex was unremarkable in every respect she had engineered. Modest furniture. No visible weapons, those were secured behind a false panel in the bedroom closet. Generic curtains. A kitchen table that held her laptop and a stack of books she rotated to maintain the appearance of ordinary reading habits. The books she actually read were kept elsewhere. She changed out of her work clothes, made eggs and toast, and sat at the kitchen table. She ate without looking at the food. She was thinking about Vale and what Vale being here might mean, and whether it was coincidence or something else, and what the answer to that question implied about her current situation. Her phone was encrypted, not the base-issued device that she carried during working hours, but the second one, a sect, which was the one that actually mattered. It had been silent for 11 days. It was not silent at 2043. The message was 3 lines, no sender ID. The authentication header at the top resolved correctly against the cipher she carried memorized, which meant it was real and not a test and not a compromise. She read it twice. Activation sequence initiated. Report to primary contact 600. Operational briefing to follow. Asset set confirmation required. Below that, a single word she hadn't seen in 2 years, NIGHTWATCH. She set the phone face down on the table. The eggs were cold. She ate the rest of them anyway, because wasting food was a habit she'd never managed to develop, and because the next 24 hours would likely not include regular meals. Then she went to the bedroom closet, pressed the panel, and retrieved the case she'd been told to keep ready. It had been ready for 2 years. She checked the rifle first function check, bore inspection, scope alignment, everything confirmed. She moved to the secondary case, her kit bag, suppressor, spare glass, personal medical supplies, communications equipment, 4 days of compressed rations, a laminated card with frequencies she'd memorized but kept anyway. Because the night her grandfather had taught her this particular habit, he'd also told her that the only people who didn't carry backups were people who'd never been in a position to need one. His voice came to her sometimes like that, specific, practical, unadorned. He hadn't been a man for ceremony. He'd been a man for preparation. Measure twice, breathe once. Never rush the fundamentals. He'd been dead for 9 years. Or at least that was what the official record said. She zipped the kit bag closed. Outside, through the thin wall, Patricia's television switched from news to a late-night program with a studio audience. Canned laughter. The cats moved around. A car passed on the county road. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the encrypted phone. NIGHTWATCH. The last time she'd seen that word was in a transmission from a forward operating base in Kandahar province 3 hours before a mission that had cost 2 of her teammates their lives and had ended, officially, in a classified after-action report that she had never been permitted to read. Officially, that mission didn't exist. Officially, neither did she not the version of her that mattered. She set the alarm for 500, lay back on the bed fully dressed, and closed her eyes. She was asleep in 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Contact Point was a storage facility on the western edge of the county, one of those interchangeable self-storage complexes that existed in the peripheral geography of every mid-sized American town, and were useful precisely because they attracted no attention and asked no questions. She'd been here twice before during the early phase of her cover assignment for what were logged as personal storage visits. She arrived at 552, parked outside the perimeter, and waited. 558, a gray panel van. She didn't recognize, pulled through the gate. She assessed. Government plates clean, not marked driver, and 1 passenger, neither visible at this distance. The van stopped in front of Unit 114. Both doors opened. She moved. The driver was a woman shorter than Evelyn, dark hair pulled tight tactical vest worn in under a civilian jacket. She had the kind of posture that came from years of wearing body armor. She turned when she heard Evelyn's footsteps on the gravel and gave a quick professional once-over. Blackwell. Who's the handler? Inside. Unit 114 held 3 folding chairs, a portable workstation, a topographic map spread across a collapsible table, and a man Evelyn recognized. Daniel Reyes, 45, heavy around the shoulders, gray at the temples now. He'd been her case officer for the last 7 months of her overseas assignment. She hadn't seen him since the debrief after Kandahar. Evelyn, he said. You look tired, she said. Everybody looks tired. He gestured at the chairs. Sit down. The woman from outside came in and pulled the unit door down to within a foot of the ground, leaving a bar of gray morning light. Reyes pulled up something on the workstation. The senator's name is Wallace Greer, he said. Armed Services Committee. He's been building a case for 8 months classified contracting fraud, black budget diversions, and what appears to be a murder-for-hire operation connected to a 2003 military program called Echo Hollow. He paused. You know that name? It wasn't a question. Evelyn sat still. You know that name? He said again, quieter. Briefing notes say I shouldn't, she said. Briefing notes are sometimes wrong. Reyes turned the laptop to face her. On the screen was a photograph, grainy, telephoto, clearly surveillance work. A man moving through a crowd. Professional gait, too steady posture. The characteristic stillness of someone trained not to look like they were watching. This individual has been identified as a contract asset connected to several political adjacent disappearances over the past 4 years. NSA metadata places him in the vicinity of 3 separate deaths that were ruled accidental or natural. He was active in 2 European theaters before transitioning to domestic work. Reyes tapped the screen. He's been tasked against Greer. Timeline? The senator's location is currently known to a very small group. That window closes in approximately 72 hours, after which he moves to a more secure arrangement. So this is a protective detail. It's more than that. Reyes folded his hands on the table. Greer has documentation. Physical documents, not digital, which is why they haven't been intercepted. He's carrying evidence about Echo Hollow that would result in federal prosecutions reaching into current government positions. He looked at her. The program that was supposed to have ended in 2003 didn't end. It evolved. It's been running under different designations ever since, and the people running it have been using contract assets to protect it. The morning light from under the door moved slightly as something passed outside. Probably just wind. Why me? Evelyn asked. Because you were cleared for Echo Hollow. I was a 19-year-old at the time of that program. I didn't know what I was cleared for. You knew more than you were told, Reyes said. It's always been your problem. She looked at him. And because, he said. More carefully, there's a personal dimension to this that your control authority felt you should know before you decided whether to accept the assignment. The woman by the door had gone very still. Reyes opened a different file on the workstation. Echo Hollow was partially compartmentalized in 2003. Several individuals who had evidence of its true scope were either retired, transferred, or he started again. One individual was formally listed as deceased following an incident in Northern Virginia. His records were sealed. His family was told he died of cardiac arrest. He turned the laptop to face her again. On the screen was a personnel file. The photograph was 20 years old. The face in it belonged to a man in his early 60s, lean, sharp-eyed, a long jaw, and a careful expression that she had known for her entire life. Her grandfather's name was in the header: Blackwell, Raymond H. DPC, deceased, classified. She looked at the screen for a long time. The bar of morning light from under the door was steady now. Somewhere outside, a bird had started calling. "He's not dead," Reyes said quietly. Her hands were flat on her thighs. She could feel her pulse slower than it should have been, probably, given what she'd just been told. Or maybe exactly as slow as it should have been, given who had raised her. "Measure twice. Breathe once." "Where is he?" she asked. Reyes shook his head. "That's part of what we need to find." She looked at the photograph for another moment. Then she turned the laptop back toward him. "Tell me everything about Echo Hollow," she said. "From the beginning. Leave nothing out." Reyes nodded. He opened the first file. Outside, the morning continued pale and ordinary. The county road, carrying its first commuters toward town. The storage facility sitting quiet in its gravel lot. Inside Unit 114, Evelyn Blackwell began learning the shape of the war she had been born into without knowing it. And somewhere in the files, in the architecture of a buried program and its long decades of protected silence, the faint outline of her grandfather's disappearance waited like a round that had never been recovered from the wall. Already chambered, already aimed. She just hadn't known at what. The files took 3 hours. Reyes walked her through them methodically, the way a good handler always did, not dumping everything at once, but layering it, letting each piece settle before adding the next. The woman by the door, whose name turned out to be Carla Mendez, said nothing during this time, stood with her back against the corrugated metal wall, and watched Evelyn with the particular attention of someone, trying to determine if a person was going to hold together or come apart. Evelyn held together. She had practice. Echo Hollow had started in 2001 as a black budget initiative under a defense contracting umbrella that no longer officially existed. Stated purpose, the version that existed in the classified annexes that people with high clearances could actually read, was long-range threat assessment and covert interdiction. A program designed to identify and neutralize emerging threats before they reached actionable status. Plausible enough on paper. The kind of thing that happened in the architecture of national security without most people knowing or needing to know. What it actually became, somewhere between 2001 and 2003, was something different. Contracts were real. The funding was real. But a significant portion of both had been redirected, laundered through subcontractors and shell arrangements into the accounts of people who were using the program's classified status as a shield. Procurement fraud on a scale that would have been career-ending and prison-guaranteeing for everyone involved. Which was precisely why everyone involved had spent 20 years making sure it never came to light. When certain individuals within the program began to raise concerns, first internally, then through back channels, the response had not been an investigation. It had been containment. That was the word Reyes used. Containment. Her grandfather had used the word burial in the single document. And the file contained that carried his handwriting, a 3-page memo, photographed, rather than the original apparently long gone. His handwriting was the same as she remembered. Angular, precise, the letters formed with the economy of someone who had spent years communicating in conditions where clarity mattered more than elegance. They are burying this, he'd written, and they will bury anyone who doesn't go quietly. The memo was dated November 2003. His official death, cardiac arrest, Northern Virginia, was dated January 2004. Evelyn sat with that arithmetic for a moment. The cardiac event, she said. Was there a body? There was a funeral, Reyes said carefully. Closed casket. That's not what I asked. Reyes was quiet for a moment. There are inconsistencies in the medical examiner records from that period. We found documentation suggesting the death was staged, not uncommon in high-value asset protection scenarios. When someone knows too much to be killed quietly, the next best option is to make them disappear convincingly and keep them somewhere they can't communicate. You're saying he's been held. We're saying we don't know. There are indicators, communications intercepts from the past 18 months, fragmentary, possibly false, that suggest an individual matching his description, and background is alive in a northern location. Remote, controlled. Reyes chose his next words with visible care. If it's him, and if those indicators are accurate, he has been isolated for nearly 2 decades. Storage unit was very quiet. Evelyn looked at the photograph again. Her grandfather at 63, lean and sharp-eyed, in a file that said he had been dead for 21 years. She'd been 7 years old when he'd taught her to shoot for the first time. A .22 rimfire on a ranch property in eastern Montana, prone position. 50 meters, paper target that had a tendency to blow in the wind. He'd spent 40 minutes on her breathing before he let her put her finger on the trigger. The shot is the last thing, he'd said. Everything before it is the job. Put all 5 rounds within 2 inches of center. He'd said nothing for a moment. Then again, Greer's documentation, she said. Does it include information on my grandfather specifically? It includes records that would expose the containment operation. Whether your grandfather is named explicitly, we don't know the full scope of what Greer has. That's part of why protecting him is critical. Reyes paused. Those documents become public or reach the right legal authority. It forces an official accounting. It makes it much harder to maintain the fiction. And the asset that's been tasked against Greer. He's good. Better than good. He was trained domestically, we think former Tier 1, separated under circumstances that are also classified. He's been operating as a contract resource for a private security firm that functions as a pass-through for people running Ecolo's current iteration. Reyes pulled up the surveillance photograph again. His operational pattern is patience. He doesn't move until the timing is optimal, which means we have a window, but it's narrow. Evelyn studied the photograph. The man in it had a particular way of standing weight, distributed slightly forward, head angled just enough to widen his peripheral field. Someone who had been in the habit of monitoring large spaces. He's done protective work, she said. Before this, Reyes looked at the photograph, then back at her. What makes you say that? The way he positions himself. He's not thinking about cover and concealment. He's thinking about observation angles. That's a detail man's habit. He's used to being the one watching the principal, which means he knows exactly how a protective detail thinks. She sat back, which is a problem. Yes, Reyes said. It is. Mendez finally spoke from the wall. Team is 2. You and me. Reyes coordinates from a remove. 2 people. 2 people we trust, Reyes said. The exposure risk on this is significant. Every additional person is a potential vector. Evelyn looked at Mendez. Mendez looked back direct, unapologetic. She had a small scar on her chin, barely visible, and her hands were the hands of someone who worked with them. What's your background? Evelyn asked. MARSOC, 6 years. Then contract work for 3. A slight pause. I was read into NIGHTWATCH 14 months ago. What were you before MARSOC? Something crossed Mendez's expression, not evasion, just the faint surprise of someone not used to the question. I grew up in Laredo. My father was a mechanic. I joined because it was the only option that made sense at 18. Evelyn nodded. That was a real answer, which was worth something. 72-hour window, she said to Reyes. Current location of Greer? Private estate on the Maine coast. Owned by a former congressional aide who has been dead for 3 years. The property is held in trust, which makes it difficult to trace. Greer has been there for 11 days. Here has been there for 11. He has 2 private security personnel with him, both former law enforcement. Neither of them read into the full picture of what he's carrying. So they're protecting a man from a threat they don't understand. Yes, that's a liability. Yes, Reyes said again. It is. She looked at the topographic map spread on the table. The main coastline rocky, exposed, the kind of terrain that punished overconfidence and rewarded patience. Ocean to the east, dense timber to the north and west, a single access. It's a single access road from the south that turned into a private drive, approximately 1.2 kilometers from the estate. She began to understand why the asset in the photograph was being patient. He was waiting for weather. The forecast for the Maine coast over the next 4 days included significant cloud cover and wind off the Atlantic conditions that would degrade most standard optical systems and create acoustic cover that would work in his favor. He would move when the conditions suited him, which meant he hadn't moved yet, which meant they still had time. Not much. We leave tonight, she said. Reyes nodded. Transportation is arranged. There's a staging point outside Portland, an hour from the estate. Gear cache is there. I want updated meteorological data every 6 hours. And I want whatever signals intelligence has on the asset's last known position. You'll have it. She stood. The folding chair scraped on the concrete floor. Outside the storage unit, the morning had continued. Without them, it was nearly 900 now, and the county road had its ordinary weekday traffic and its ordinary weekday sounds. She thought about the encrypted phone back at the duplex. She thought about Patricia's television through the shared wall. She thought about the flickering fluorescent light in the administrative pool at Falcon Ridge that nobody had fixed yet, and whether it would still be flickering a week from now, and whether anyone would notice that the desk in the second row was empty. Probably not. That had always been the point. She went back to the duplex to collect her kit. She had 2 hours. The kit bag was already packed, she'd done that the night before, but she went through it again anyway, methodically, item by item. It was a habit she'd been unable to break since the perfect time. The first time she'd discovered a malfunction at a moment when a malfunction was the worst possible thing to discover. Her grandfather's voice again. Check it when you're calm. Only time checking means anything. She was calm now. She was almost always calm, which was something that people who hadn't known her long tended to misread as coldness. It wasn't coldness. It was, as her grandfather had put it once, the practical preference for not making bad situations worse. Stripped the rifle, cleaned it, and reassembled it. Checked the scope of Night Force ATCR, 735 by 56, with a custom turret elevation chart she'd built herself based on the 0.338 Norma Magnum data she'd compiled over 2 years of range work. Set it aside. Worked through the rest of the kit, communications equipment, personal medical supplies, the compressed rations she hoped she wouldn't need, the laminated frequency cards she carried, even though she had the frequencies memorized. At 1045, her phone, the base issued one, buzzed. She looked at it. The message was from Vale. Need to talk. Not on base. Off the record. She stared at the message for long enough that it told her something about her own state of mind, which was that she was more unsettled by this than she wanted to be. Vale was a complication she hadn't accounted for. A former 317 with good eyes, and the professional habit of noticing things other people missed that was a specific kind of problem. She typed back, not a good time. His reply came in 40 seconds. I know about NIGHTWATCH. She set the phone down, picked it up. Read the message again. Then she typed, where are you? Parking lot. Diner on Route 9. Blue pickup. She looked at her kit bag. Looked at the time. She had 90 minutes before she needed to leave for the staging point. She shouldered the canvas bag, the regular one, not the kit, and left. The diner on Route 9 was the kind of place that had been operating continuously since approximately 1974 without anyone having substantially changed it. Vinyl booths, a counter with revolving pie display, a coffee machine that sounded like it had emphysema. Vale was in the last booth, facing the door, with a coffee and a piece of pie he appeared to have ordered out of obligation rather than appetite. He was in civilian clothes jeans, a flannel shirt, work boots. He looked like half the county. Evelyn slid into the seat across from him. The waitress materialized from somewhere, and Evelyn said coffee without looking up from Vale's face. How? She said. That's the question you're leading with. Yes. Vale wrapped both hands around his mug. 4 years ago, I was doing contract analytical work for a defense intelligence office out of Fort Meade. Background research on irregular programs, the kind of stuff that falls between the formal structure and the classified annexes. I came across a reference to NIGHTWATCH in a routing chain that should have been scrubbed, but wasn't. Pulled the thread. He paused. I was told very clearly to stop pulling it. Did you? Mostly. He took a drink of his coffee. The placement at Falcon Ridge wasn't random. The facility's assignment is real. There is genuinely a security improvement project, but I requested the posting because of what I'd found. Because I knew NIGHTWATCH had active personnel at this installation, and I wanted to understand what was happening. The waitress brought Evelyn's coffee. She wrapped her hands around it without drinking. And now you've found me, she said. You found yourself, he said. The checkpoint situation wasn't subtle. It was never going to be subtle. Clearance routing was designed for exactly that scenario, fast, visible, and intimidating enough to end questions. It wasn't supposed to start new ones. It would have ended questions for most people. You're not most people. No, Vale said. I'm not. He pushed the pie slightly to the side. I know Greer's in Maine. I know there's a threat against him. And I know NIGHTWATCH has activated to address it. What I don't know is what the operational plan looks like, or how much time there is. How do you know any of that? Because I've been watching the signals traffic come through the Fort Meade channels for 6 weeks. The activation of a NIGHTWATCH asset always produces a specific pattern in adjacent communications, the suppression of certain data streams, the rerouting of others. Professionally, someone with the right baseline knowledge can see the shape of it, even if they can't read the content. Evelyn looked at him across the coffee mugs and the untouched pie. He was telling the truth. She could tell because he wasn't managing his expression the way liars did. He wasn't working to appear credible. He was simply laying out what he knew and letting it sit. That was a different kind of person entirely. What do you want? She asked. To help. That's not a specific answer. I know the terrain around that estate. I saw Rancelets on it 2 months ago, when I first identified it as a likely safe house location based on the ownership pattern. He reached into his jacket and put a folded topographic sheet on the table between them, not the same map she'd seen in the storage unit, but annotated differently, with handwritten observation notes in a cramped print style. Eastern Approach has a firing corridor that Reyes's map doesn't account for. There's a ridgeline, approximately 900 meters from the main building, that's hidden by a terrain fold. From the estate's perspective, it doesn't exist. From that ridgeline, you have an unobstructed angle to 3 of the 4 access points. She looked at the map without touching it. He was right. Terrain fold would mask anyone operating from that ridgeline from standard observation positions. It was the kind of detail that only showed up if you'd actually been there, on the ground, looking at it. You were out there 2 months ago, she said. Yes. Why? Because I wanted to understand the full picture before I tried to make contact with NIGHTWATCH. He met her eyes. I wasn't sure I'd be trusted. I needed to bring something real. Picked up the map. Studied it. The notes were thorough observation angles, vegetation densities estimates, estimated ranges to key terrain features. He'd done this properly. He'd done it alone, which was either very confident or very reckless. And from what she could see of the methodology, it was the former. You realize, she said, that if you're compromised in any way, by anyone you become a liability that could get Greer killed. Yes, and you're asking to come anyway. I'm not asking, he said. I'm telling you I'm coming. What I'm asking is whether we do this as a team or whether we waste time arguing about it first. The diner made its diner sounds around them. Coffee machine. Low conversation from the booth at the far end. Someone's truck radio outside. Audible through the glass door. Evelyn finished her coffee. Leave your vehicle here, she said, standing. You're riding with me. If at any point Reyes decides you're a security risk, You accept that decision without argument. And if I tell you to do something during the operation, you do it without waiting to understand why. Vale pulled on his jacket. Those are fair terms. They're not terms. They're the conditions. She picked up the annotated map. And I'm keeping this, I figured. She walked to the register, paid for both coffees, and left the pie. Reyes's reaction to Vale's presence at the staging point outside Portland was controlled in the way that a man's reaction becomes controlled when he is too experienced to express what he actually wants. To express in front of people he can't fully read. He looked at Vale, looked at Evelyn. "Explain," he said. She did, concisely. When she got to the annotated map and what it contained, she laid it on the table next to his version and pointed out the ridgeline discrepancy. Reyes studied both maps for approximately 90 seconds without speaking. "Then you surveilled the site independently." "Yes," Vale said. "With whose authorization?" "My own." Reyes's expression didn't change. "And you've been monitoring NIGHTWATCH signal patterns from Fort Meade access?" "Yes, that's a federal offense." "Probably," Vale said. "So is whatever's been running under Echo Hollow for 20 years. Silence. Reyes looked at Mendez. Mendez gave a slight shrug, barely perceptible, but she'd been watching Vale since they'd walked in and had apparently made some assessment that inclined her toward neutral rather than against. "If I read you into this operation," Reyes said to Vale, "and you become a liability at any point." "I know what happens," Vale said. "Do you?" "I've been in the field. I know what operational liability means." Reyes was quiet for another moment. Then he turned to his workstation and pulled up a new document. "We have updated signals intelligence on the asset. He moved last night, repositioned from a motel outside Augusta to a location approximately 30 kilometers from the estate. He's staging." He looked at the room. "We have maybe 36 hours. Possibly if he decides the current weather window is good enough." Staging Point was a rented property, a farmhouse on the edge of a rural county, the kind of place that had been bought and sold and leased and left vacant in cycles that nobody tracked carefully. It had heat and running water and a barn that served as vehicle storage. The gear cache was in the barn, weapons, ammunition, communications equipment, 2 sets of cold-weather tactical clothing in appropriate sizes. Evelyn worked through the cache with Mendez while Reyes briefed Vale on the full operational picture. She could hear their conversation at the other end of the barn, low, deliberate, the back and forth of two people sizing each other up through the medium of information exchange. "He's solid," Mendez said quietly, without looking up from the equipment she was checking. "You think so?" "The map. That took discipline. You don't do that kind of prep work unless you're serious." She ran a function check on a suppressed HK-41 Steen. Also, he carried his coffee with his left hand at the diner. Evelyn looked at her. His strong side hand was free. "The whole time," Mendez said. "He wasn't aware he was doing it. That's not something you practice. That's something that gets built in. You were watching." "I watch everybody." Mendez set down the rifle. "Doesn't mean I trust him. Just means he is what he says he is." Evelyn nodded. She pulled the MK-21 from her case and began her pre-operation check. Bore inspection first. The barrel was clean. She'd cleaned it that morning, but she checked anyway. Then the action, the magazine seating, the scope adjustments. She pulled her dope notebook and cross-referenced the range data with the updated meteorological report on Reyes's workstation. The weather over the Maine coast was changing. A front moving in from the northwest would bring temperature drops and shifting wind, the kind of variability that demanded real-time adjustment rather than static pre-calculation. She worked through the numbers, updating her elevation and windage corrections for the conditions she expected to encounter in the next 24 to 36 hours. She'd done this kind of work in worse conditions. In Kandahar, she'd shot in sustained winds that would have made most people give up the position. In the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, at altitude, in cold that made the metal burn to the touch, she'd held solutions that the instructors at Scout Sniper School would have called unworkable. But she'd lost people in those places too. That was the part that didn't make it into the after-action reports. Part that existed only in the permanent record of her own memory, which she couldn't file or classify or seal. Closed the dope notebook. Reyes had finished briefing Vale and was now on the phone, low, rapid, the voice of someone coordinating logistics at the edge of a narrow window. Question, Vale said from behind her. She didn't turn around. Go ahead. The ridgeline I mapped. If our target has been doing his own reconnaissance, and I think he may have found it independently, the best firing position within range. That makes it a contested resource. She'd already thought about this. Yes. Which means we either move to own it before he can, or we use it as a kill zone, an approach from a different angle. Or, she said, we let him take it and use that to our advantage. Pause. Explain, Vale said. The word came out careful, not skeptical, just genuinely wanting to understand. Turned then. He was standing with his arms at his sides, his annotated map in one hand, watching her with the attention of someone who was actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to speak. He's going to go to ground on that ridgeline, she said. When he does, his attention will be forward toward the estate. His threat orientation will be one-directional. She held his gaze. That's when he's most exposed from behind. Vale looked at the map in his hand, looked at her. You'd let him set up. I'd let him commit to the position. Once he's committed, he's predictable. She turned back to the rifle. Predictable is manageable. Outside the barn, the main wind moved through the trees. The temperature had dropped. Since they'd arrived, she could feel it through the barn's thin walls, the particular edge of northeastern cold that came off the ocean and settled into the ground. Somewhere north of them, on a rocky coastal estate, a senator sat with two security personnel who didn't fully understand what they were guarding against. And somewhere between them and that estate, a man who'd spent years learning to disappear was finishing his preparations. She zipped the rifle case and lifted it. Get some rest, she told Vale. We move at 200. He nodded once and walked back toward Reyes without argument. Mendez appeared at Evelyn's shoulder. You really think he'll take the ridgeline? It's what I'd do, Evelyn said. That's either reassuring or extremely concerning. Probably both. She carried the rifle case toward the farmhouse. Wake me at 130. The farmhouse was cold and smelled of disuse, and the particular emptiness of a building that had been waiting for a long time without being used. She found a cot in one of the back rooms, set her kit at the foot of it, and lay down without removing her boots. She thought about her grandfather's handwriting on the 3-page memo, angular and precise. The same handwriting that had labeled her first-range targets, that had corrected her grip on a cold Montana morning 20 years ago, that had written on the inside cover of the first book, marksmanship he'd ever given her. Every shot has a beginning. Find the beginning first. She'd read that book until the spine gave out. Still had the cover. Deceased. Classified. Cold settled into the room. The wind moved against the farmhouse walls. Closed her eyes. At 130, Mendez knocked twice and opened the door. Evelyn was already sitting up. She was already sitting up when Mendez knocked. Not the groggy, disoriented kind of awake that came from real sleep, the immediate, clear-eyed kind that came from 2 years of training herself to rest in 30-minute intervals without ever fully letting go of the thread. Her boots were on. Her kit was at the foot of the cot, exactly where she'd placed it. The room was dark and cold and smelled of old wood and dust, and outside the farmhouse, the main wind had picked up in the hours she'd been horizontal. She checked her watch. 128. Mendez had knocked 2 minutes early. That meant something had changed. She was through the door before Mendez could speak. The main room of the farmhouse had been converted into their operations center. Reyes' workstation, the topographic maps, a portable communications array that Vale had assembled from the gear cache, with a competence that had visibly adjusted Reyes' assessment of him. Now all 3 of them were clustered around the workstation, and the quality of the silence in the room was the kind that preceded bad news. Talk, Evelyn said. Reyes turned the laptop toward her. Signals intercepts. 40 minutes ago, The asset mad contact with his handler encrypted, but the pattern matches his previous communications architecture. The exchange was brief. He pointed to the transcript on screen. 2 lines of decoded text. He's moving tonight, not tomorrow. She read the transcript, looked at the meteorological data on the adjacent screen. The front that had been forecast for tomorrow morning had accelerated wind off the ocean, cloud cover, temperature dropping fast. Conditions he'd been waiting for weren't coming at dawn. They were already here. How long until he's at the ridgeline? Vale asked. If he left his staging point when the intercept was made, approximately 90 minutes, maybe less. Reyes looked at Evelyn. The estate's security personnel don't know. We haven't been able to establish direct contact without blowing the operation's cover. Greer, she said. We're in the estate main residence. East wing, 2nd floor. Based on the room light patterns from the aerial feed, he's been using the Zersnuddy most evenings. Reyes pulled up a satellite image grainy, time-stamped 3 hours prior, but enough to work with. That puts him on the eastern face of the building. So, directly in the firing corridor from the ridgeline. Evelyn looked at Vale. Vale was already looking at the map. 90 minutes, she said. If we leave now, we have maybe 40 minutes before he's set up and has an angle. The approach road is 2 kilometers of gravel, Mendez said. We go dark, on foot from the tree line. That's 25 minutes minimum. Then we don't take the approach road. Evelyn was already moving to the gear. Vale, the northern access, you mapped the logging cut on the backside of the ridge. Unimproved track. Passable in a truck, barely. How far does it take us? To within 600 meters of the ridgeline base. He was thinking, recalculating. She could see it working in his expression. If we push the vehicle, 20 minutes. Then a ground approach up the back slope, another 15, maybe 12. If the vegetation isn't worse than I remember. 12 then, she said. Evelyn Reyes started. I heard you. 90 minutes. She was pulling on her cold weather layer, working the kit bag's straps. We have time if we don't waste it. The objective is to prevent an engagement, not win one. Greer stays alive, the documents stay intact, the asset is neutralized or deterred. In that order. Reyes stood. I need to know you're clear on the priority sequence. Paused, with one strap buckled, and looked at him. Greer first, she said. Always Greer first. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. They went out into the cold. The temperature had dropped 8 degrees since they'd arrived at the farmhouse. The wind was northeasterly, carrying the particular wet edge of Atlantic air that settled into the joints and stayed there, not the dry cold of high altitude that she knew from Afghanistan, but a heavier, more persistent cold that had a way of making everything slightly harder than it needed to be. Vale drove. He knew the logging cut, and there was no argument about it. Operational efficiency outranked ego, which was the first sign that he was actually what he said he was. Mendez took the passenger seat. Evelyn sat behind Vale with the MK-21 case across her knees and ran through her adjustments in her head. Temperature, approximately 38 degrees Fahrenheit, dropping. Wind, sustained 12 to 15 knots from the northeast, gusting to 20. Humidity, high. She pulled her dope notebook by feel in the dark and made 3 corrections to her elevation data, working by the dim illumination of a red lens penlight. The 0.338 Norma Magnum was less forgiving of environmental variables than lighter rounds, which was also why it hit harder and held energy further downrange than most alternatives. The logging cut was exactly as Vale had described it, barely a road, more like a scar through the timber that had been made by machinery and then left to slowly grow back in. The truck lurched and bottomed twice in the first kilometer. The third time badly enough that something under the chassis made a sound that nobody commented on because commenting on it wouldn't help. At the 600-meter mark, Vale stopped the truck, killed the lights, and shut the engine. Silence. Not complete silence, the wind in the trees above them, the distant periodic sound of ocean against est rocks. Somewhere far to the right, the movement of what was probably a large animal through the brush. But operational silence. No human activity, no indication they'd been heard. They moved. The slope up the backside of the ridgeline was steeper than the topographic map suggested it always was, which was one of the things maps were consistently dishonest about. The vegetation was dense in the lower portion, thinning as they climbed toward the exposed ridge crest. Evelyn went first, Vale and Mendez behind her at 5-meter intervals, all three of them moving in the particular way that people trained in this discipline moved heel to toe. Weight distributed, deliberate placement of each footfall, weapons muzzle down and hands free when necessary to negotiate the terrain. She didn't use a light. She'd operated without light often enough that her eyes had developed the habit of working with whatever existed starlight. Ambient reflection, the pale edge of a cloud cover that wasn't quite complete. The ridgeline above her was a slightly lighter shade of dark than the tree line, which was enough. 11 minutes up the slope, she stopped, put her hand back, fist closed. Stop. They stopped. She crouched. At the crest of the ridge, perhaps 40 meters ahead, and to her left, something had moved. Not much, not dramatically. But the tree line at the ridge's edge had a slightly different texture than it had had 3 seconds ago, and the explanation for that was a narrow list. She held position. 2 minutes. 3. The wind moved. The trees moved with it, and there, in the movement, the outline of something that didn't move with the wind, a shape that had its own anchor. Low to the ground, slightly left of center on the crest in the notch between two large granite outcroppings that would provide excellent lateral cover while maintaining the forward observation angle. He was already there. She processed this in approximately 2 seconds. If he was already positioned, they were behind the timeline. The firing corridor from this ridgeline to the estate's eastern face was clear. Greer was in that rear study. She turned her head fractionally. In the darkness, she made eye contact with Vale, or approximated it, close enough. She held up 2 fingers, pointed to her eyes, pointed toward the ridge. He'd seen it too. A slight movement of his head confirmed. She turned to Mendez and signaled, "Hold position." Then she began moving again. Slower now. Much slower. Not up toward the crest, but laterally, working along the back slope below the ridgeline, keeping the mass of the ridge between herself and the crest. She needed a position that gave her an angle, without skyling herself, without giving him anything to hear or see. She found it 20 meters to the right, a depression in the slope, partially sheltered by a fallen spruce, with a natural gap in the tree line above that, open toward the crest at an angle that, if she positioned correctly, would give her a sight line to the notch between the granite outcroppings. 900 meters to the estate, maybe 60 meters to the man in the notch. She opened the rifle case without sound. Each movement was learned and economical. The case latch, the foam, the rifle lifting free. She went to prone in the depression, letting the fallen spruce form a natural support to her left. She did not use a bipod. The terrain didn't allow it cleanly, and she'd learned long ago not to fight the ground. Scope up. She dialed the magnification down. This wasn't a long shot. This was a close observation. She needed information before she needed precision. Through the scope, the crest of the ridge resolved. The notch between the granite outcroppings was clear, and in the notch, settled into a prone position with professional economy, was the man from the surveillance photograph. He had a rifle, long-barreled, suppressed, mounted on a bipod. He was looking downslope toward the estate. She could see the faint movement of his scope as he made adjustments. He was close to ready. Her radio, a bone conduction unit, worn at the jaw, crackled once. Vale's voice barely audible. "Mendez has a sight line from her position. She's asking if you want her to take it." She pressed her transmit button twice. No, because this was what she'd told Vale in the barn. Once he committed to the position, he was predictable. Predictable was manageable, but manageable didn't mean what most people thought it meant. She thought about Greer in the study. 2 security personnel downstairs who didn't understand the threat they were facing. The documents that Reyes needed intact. The accounting that 20 years of silence had been designed to prevent. She thought about what her grandfather would have done. The shot is the last thing. Everything before it is the job. Keyed her radio. "Reyes, the asset is positioned. He's approximately 40 minutes from optimal firing conditions based on current wind patterns. He's waiting for a lull. I need you to contact the estate's security right now. Get Greer out of the east wing and into the interior of the building. Do not explain. Do not negotiate. Just make it happen. A pause. Then Reyes's voice, that contact risks exposing. It risks less than the alternative. She kept her voice flat, nearly below audible, her lips barely moving. Make the call. Another pause. Making the call, Reyes said. She went back to the scope. The man in the notch was very still now. She'd seen that kind of stillness before. It was the particular settled quality that came in the final phase of long-range preparation, when everything external got filtered out and the shooter and the target and the distance between them became the only things that existed. He was good. His position was clean and economical. His scope was a high-end unit, probably Night Force or Schmidt. She couldn't determine which at this distance and angle. His rifle was likely a 0.3. Win mag or similar. He'd want a compromise between terminal performance and noise signature given the suppressor. She watched him and she thought about angles. The problem was this: she could neutralize him from where she was. The geometry was in her favor. She had an angle to his position that he didn't know existed. Her position was below his sight line, and at 60 meters with this rifle, the outcome was not in question. But that was the last resort, and it wasn't the first resort, because Reyes's objective was documentation and accountability, not bodies. And a body would ask questions that would complicate the next 36 hours in ways that would be difficult to manage. She needed him off the ridgeline, alive. She considered her options, and none of them were clean, and that was the nature of field work, which was why people who romanticized it hadn't done much of it. Her radio again, Reyes. Estate security confirmed movement. Greer is being relocated to the interior. West-facing room, ground floor. She exhaled slowly. Good. One problem reduced. But the man in the notch didn't know that yet. And when he acquired his target and found the study window dark and empty, he would either disengage or he would adapt. If he adapted, moved position, tried a different angle, the situation became significantly more complicated. She needed to know which way he'd go. She watched him for 4 more minutes. At the 4-minute mark, his scope angle changed. He'd acquired the study window. She saw the micro-adjustment of his position, a slight forward shift. The suppressor tracking fractionally left. He was on target. Then nothing. He held. 30 seconds. A minute. The window was dark. She watched his body language through scope, the way she watched everything, reading it for information rather than performance. His shoulders dropped a fraction. His head came slightly off the stock. He was recalculating. He knows the room is empty, Vale murmured in her earpiece. Yes. What does he do now? Give him 90 seconds. She counted. At 70 seconds he moved. Not away laterally. He was repositioning along the ridgeline crest, toward a slightly different angle, trying to find a sight line to the rest of the building's eastern face. He was committed to the operation. He wasn't leaving, which was a problem, because as he moved laterally along, the crest low, disciplined. Good, he crossed through a gap in the granite where the ridgeline offered no lateral cover. For approximately 4 seconds, his left side was exposed to Evelyn's position. She already had the solution dialed. Vale, she said. Go. When I fire, you move to the crest. You'll have maybe 8 seconds before he processes what happened. I need you at his position. A pause. What are you shooting? His rifle. Another pause. Shorter, his rifle. The bipod mount. This angle. If I hit the magazine well, or the action housing, it'll disable the weapon without. I understood the first time. Vale's voice had changed. Not skeptical. Something else. You're going to hit a bipod mount at 60 meters in the dark. I'm going to hit it, she said, in the next 3 seconds, before he clears the gap. Ready? A beat. Ready, Vale said. She settled. The gap in the granite. The lateral movement. The bipod mount, she could see it in the scope. The faint outline of the rifle's forward support as he moved. A moving target at 60 meters was not the same as a stationary target at 1,200. The The geometry was different. The required lead was different. The margin for error was very small, and the consequence of the wrong kind of error was something she had already calculated and set aside, because she couldn't do this job and hold that calculation at the same time. She settled her breathing, found the rhythm. Heartbeat steady, she could feel it. The spacing between beats, the same way she'd felt it in Kandahar, in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan at 1,700 meters in wind, that shouldn't have allowed the shot she needed to make. Breathe once. The trigger broke. The suppressed report was still loud. At this distance, the Mk-21 suppressor reduced the signature, but didn't eliminate it. What it eliminated was the muzzle flash and the directional clarity of the sound, which was what mattered. Through the scope, she saw the rifle spin and drop. Not because she'd hit the man, she hadn't. She'd hit the forward stock assembly near the bipod mount, and the impact at that velocity had wrenched the weapon from his grip and driven it off the ridgeline edge into the timber below. He went flat. His hand went to his sidearm. He was looking forward, then left, then right, trying to determine where the shot had come from, running the acoustic signature against what he knew about his own position and the surrounding terrain. He was fast. He was thinking clearly under shock, which marked him as what Reyes had said he was. But he was looking in the wrong direction. Vale cleared the crest from behind. He came over the top of the ridgeline fast and low, covering the distance to the notch in the time it took the man to reorient. What followed was brief and violent, and not elegant in any way. Vale went for the weapon hand. The man was already turning, collided with the kind of compact physical force that happened when two trained people met in. When two tradespeople met in a space where there was no room for technique, only outcome. Evelyn was moving before the sound of the collision reached her. Up the slope, through the gap in the trees, over the ridgeline crest. By the time she arrived at the notch, Vale had control of the sidearm, and the man was face down on the granite, with Vale's knee in his back, and one arm at an angle that made further resistance a losing proposition. Mendez came over the ridge from the other direction. 30 seconds later, the man on the ground said nothing. He was breathing hard, and there was a cut on his forehead from the granite, not serious, but bleeding the way head wounds did. He turned his face slightly to the side, and she could see his expression. Not fear. Calculation. He was already assessing the situation, counting people, looking for variables. "It's a short list," she told him. "You're outnumbered. Your rifle is gone. Your principal has moved, and you've lost the firing solution. Operation is over." He said nothing. "I'm not interested in you," she continued. "I'm interested in the people who hired you. When the right authorities ask you about Echo Hollow, the intelligence response is to answer them." She paused. "The alternative involves a set of legal circumstances that will be substantially less comfortable than honesty." He looked at her. Blood from the forehead cut had reached his cheekbone. His breathing was slowing, controlled, deliberate. "You made that shot," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Yes, in these conditions." The conditions were manageable. Something moved in his expression. Not quite respect, closer to the professional acknowledgement of a fact. "Who are you?" "Nobody you were briefed on," she said. "Which means whoever built your intelligence package left things out." She straightened up and looked at Vale, who was watching the man with the focused attention of someone who hadn't relaxed yet and wasn't going to for a while. There was blood on Vale's forearm, not his, from the contact, and his jacket had torn at the shoulder seam. He looked like a man who had just done something difficult, rather than a man who had done something easy. She appreciated the difference. "Secure him," she told Mendez. "Reyes will have a transport protocol." She stepped back from the notch and keyed her radio. "Reyes, asset is detained. Greer is safe. We need extraction and a secure holding arrangement. What's your status?" Reyes's voice came back immediately. "Extraction is 12 minutes. I've been in contact with the federal authority, contact they're aware, and en route to a secondary point." "What's the condition of the asset?" "Alive. Superficial injury. Cooperative enough. And your team?" She looked at Vale. Looked at Mendez, who was efficiently and professionally zip-tying the man's wrists with the calm competence of someone who had done this before. looked at the rocky crest of the ridge with its granite outcroppings and the ocean wind coming in hard off the water, and the distant lights of the estate, visible through the timber, too, to the south. Functional, she said. A pause on Reyes's end. Then, good work. She released the transmit button. She stood at the ridgeline crest and looked south toward the estate. Windows were mostly dark now. Greer's security had followed the instruction, gotten the senator to the interior, turned off lights that didn't need to be on. Two people who hadn't understood the threat they were facing had responded correctly anyway, which was the best you could ever hope for from people operating with incomplete information. The wind came in from the northeast. The ocean was invisible in the dark, but she could hear it, the continuous low impact of water against stone, the sound that had been there for thousands of years before any of this, and would be there for thousands afterward. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. People who had seen her work were sometimes disconcerted by this, as though steadiness in a difficult moment was something that required explanation. She'd stopped trying to explain it years ago. It was, as simply as she could put it, the result of doing one thing long enough and seriously enough that the difficulty stopped feeling like the central fact. The central fact was always the work. She began the walk back down the ridge toward the truck. Behind her, she heard Vale say something quiet to Mendez. She heard Mendez respond. She didn't turn around to look. Whatever they were saying was between them, and she had her own thoughts that needed the next 12 minutes of walking through cold timber to process. She thought about her grandfather's memo. They will bury anyone who doesn't go quietly. He hadn't gone quietly. He'd paid for it. Tonight a senator was alive because of decisions made in a maintenance storage unit off a county road at 600 and in a farmhouse in rural Maine and on a rocky ridge in the dark. Tonight a document existed somewhere inside that estate that named names and exposed 2 decades of protected crimes. And somewhere, in a remote location that Reyes's intelligence suggested, might be somewhere north, somewhere cold, isolated, controlled, there was a man who had tried to do the right thing in 2003, won, and had been buried for it. She reached the base of the slope. The logging cut was ahead, the truck a dark shape in the darker trees. She wasn't finished. The detained asset and the senator's documents and the safe completion of this phase of the operation, those were real, and they mattered. But they were the beginning of something, not the end. Reyes had said, if it's him, he has been isolated for nearly 2 decades. 21 years. She opened the truck door and put the rifle case in the back seat and sat in the cold cab and looked at the trees around her and did not allow herself to feel the full weight of that number, because feeling it fully at this moment would not serve any purpose except to make the next part harder. The next part was going to be hard enough. Mendez arrived first, then Vale with the detained man, who moved under his own power with his hands secured behind him and said nothing the entire walk down. She'd assessed him correctly. He was a professional, and professionals in his situation knew when a phase was over and adapted accordingly. They loaded into the truck. Vale started the engine. In the 12 minutes before extraction arrived at the logging cuts junction with the county road, nobody said anything that wasn't operational. Distances, timing, the transfer protocol for the detained asset, the confirmation that Reyes had what he needed to secure Greer's transport to the federal contact. But at one point stopped at the junction. With the engine idling, Vale glanced at her in the mirror. She met his eyes. He looked back at the road without speaking. It was enough. What it communicated was the thing that people who'd been through something together sometimes communicated without words, which was that they'd both been present for something that had required more than was comfortable, and they'd come through it. And that was all that needed to be said right now. The extraction vehicle arrived at 341. When the asset was transferred, and Mendez had gone with the federal contact team, Evelyn sat in the back of the remaining vehicle while Reyes went over the documentation on his portable unit, and the vehicle moved through the dark main roads toward a point she didn't particularly care about yet. She opened the dope notebook. On the last page, Below the range corrections and the environmental variables and the elevation data she'd built over 2 years of careful work, she wrote 3 things: the time, the distance, and the result. Then she turned to the inside back cover. She'd taped something there when she'd first built this notebook, the same way she'd taped the cover of the marksmanship book her grandfather had given her. A small photograph, old, slightly faded, taken in eastern Montana on a cold morning 20 years ago. A lean man with sharp eyes, helping a 7-year-old girl with a .22 rimfire. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the notebook, put it in her kit bag, and stared out the window at the dark Maine landscape moving past. Reyes looked up from his workstation. He watched her for a moment, the careful watch of someone who understood what had just been asked of a person and was gauging the cost. The next phase, he said quietly. Finding him. She turned from the window. I know, she said. Tell me where we start. Tell me where we start. Reyes looked at her for a moment, the way people looked at something they weren't sure how to handle. Then he turned back to his workstation and pulled up a file she hadn't seen in the storage unit briefing. We start with what Greer's documents actually contain, he said. We didn't have the full inventory until 40 minutes ago. His security transmitted a manifest to our federal contact during the extraction. He turned the screen toward her. Echo Hollow's containment operation named 3 individuals who were processed through what the program called a relocation protocol. 2 of them are confirmed dead natural causes, both which at this point means nothing. Third, my grandfather, is listed as active status in the containment records. Reyes said it carefully. Like a man delivering news he knew was going to land hard and was trying to control how it landed. Active status means he was alive as of the last internal audit of the program. Audit is dated 14 months ago. The vehicle moved through the dark. Side, Maine pines moved in the headlights and disappeared. 14 months ago. She did the arithmetic. He would be 84 years old now. 21 years of whatever the containment protocol considered appropriate conditions for a man who knew too much to kill and too much to release. She thought about what 21 years of that looked like on a person, and she set the thought down before it went further because she needed to think clearly, and grief, even the anticipated kind, was corrosive to clear thinking. The location, she said. That's the problem. Reyes closed the screen slightly, not hiding it, just resetting. The documents identify a facility designation, waypoint 7. Geographic coordinates were never included in the paperwork, which was standard practice for containment sites. The physical location was handled verbally and kept in a separate chain of custody. So we have a name and nothing else. We have a name, a facility designation, and the people who ran the program. Reyes paused. Some of whom are currently in federal custody. Some of whom will be within the next 72 hours as Greer's documentation moves through the right channels. And one of them knows where waypoint 7 is. Yes. She sat back against the vehicle seat. Her kit bag was at her feet. The rifle case was in the back. 12 hours ago, she'd been lying on a cot in a farmhouse trying to rest. And before that, she'd been in a storage unit learning that the man she'd spent half her life grieving was probably alive. The accumulated weight of those hours was something she could feel in her shoulders and behind her eyes, but she didn't examine it too closely because the next part required the same quality of attention that everything else had required. And she was not done yet. Which of the people going into custody is most likely to have operational knowledge of site locations? She asked. Reyes looked at her steadily. A man named Philip Corin, former deputy director of a now-dissolved Defense Intelligence Office. He was the program's administrative head from 2001 to 2009, the entire period during which the containment protocol was established and executed. Where is he now? He became aware of Greer's documentations like approximately 6 days ago. He's been attempting to manage the situation through intermediaries. The asset you detained tonight was one of those intermediaries. The operation failed and the asset in federal hands. Corin's position is significantly reduced. Reyes chose his next word carefully. He's negotiating. With whom? With the federal authority contact. Through a lawyer. A pause. He's offering cooperation in exchange for sentencing consideration. He'll trade Waypoint 7's location. If it benefits him sufficiently, yes. But he's not stupid. He knows that once he gives up the location, his leverage is gone. So he's holding it. Reyes met her eyes. There's a debrief scheduled for this morning. 8 o'clock, Federal Building in Portland. Corin will be present with his counsel. Our federal contact has requested that NIGHTWATCH provide a representative, someone with operational knowledge of the program's scope, who can participate in the debrief and assess whether Corin's cooperation is genuine. She understood then why Reyes had said this morning, instead of later or soon. 4 hours from now, she said. Yes. You want me in the room. I want someone's in that room who can tell when Corin is lying about what he knows and when he's lying about what he's willing to give up. Those are different kinds of lying, and they require different approaches. He looked at her steadily. You also have a personal stake that he doesn't know about, which is either an advantage or a liability, depending on how you manage it. She thought about that. It's an advantage, she said, if I know it and he doesn't. Yes. Reyes closed the laptop. Get some sleep if you can. We'll be in Portland in 2 hours. She didn't sleep. She sat in the dark vehicle and watched the main landscape give way to highway and thought about Philip Corin, whom she'd never met, who had spent 8 years administering a program that had buried her grandfather and called it a cardiac event and sent a closed casket to a funeral that her family had stood around in the cold November rain of 2004 while a bugler played and a flag, folded with ceremony and handed to her grandmother with the thanks of a government that had arranged the entire thing. Her grandmother had kept that flag on the mantle until she died 3 years later. Evelyn had taken it when she cleared the house. She still had it in the same closet, where she kept the false panel and the kit bag and the rifle that had once been her grandfather's part before it became hers, through the kind of inheritance that doesn't get discussed at estate readings. She thought about all of this in the dark of the vehicle, and she was very careful to think about it calmly, because the debrief room in 4 hours required a version of her that Philip Corin would underestimate. And the version of her that Philip Corin would underestimate was the version she was best at being. The federal building in Portland was the kind of structure that communicated authority through a neutral architecture, gray stone, recessed windows, kind of lobby that had been designed to make everyone who entered it feel slightly smaller than they'd been outside. Security checkpoint took 7 minutes. Reyes went through first. She followed. Vale was not with them. He'd been separated at the extraction point. His involvement in the operation existed in a category that the federal contact had preferred to keep at arm's length, at least until the paper trail caught up with the operational reality. She'd given him her phone number, the encrypted one, before they'd separated, and he'd taken it without comment. He was the kind of person who understood that some things resolved in time and some things didn't, and the difference wasn't always apparent immediately. The debrief room was on the 4th floor. It had a table, 8 chairs, a recording system, a one-way window that everyone in the room knew existed and nobody acknowledged, and a smell of recycled air and institutional coffee that was universal to every government facility she'd ever been inside. Philip Corin was already seated when they arrived. He was 71, which was something she hadn't expected to matter and did. Not because it inspired sympathy, but because it complicated the picture. He looked like a man who had spent 50 years sitting in rooms like this, one comfortable in the architecture of consequence, accustomed to the rhythms of formal interrogation. He had an expensive suit and a lawyer to his left, and the particular composure of someone who had made the calculation that composure was his best remaining asset. The federal contact was a woman named Hartwell, mid-50s, close-cropped hair, the no-nonsense effect of a career DOJ attorney who had given up performing patients several decades ago. She introduced herself to Reyes with 2 words and a handshake, and then looked at Evelyn. You're the operational representative. Yes. Hartwell looked at her for a moment. Something in the look said she'd expected someone different, older probably, male possibly. She didn't say any of this. Fine, Hartwell said. We're on the record. Mr. Corin has agreed to provide cooperation within the scope of his counsel's parameters. We're here to determine whether that cooperation constitutes material value. She sat, Mr. Corin. Let's start with Echo Hollow's current operational status. Corin's lawyer, a thin man with rimless glasses, whose name Evelyn immediately forgot, touched Corin's arm. Corin waved the touch off. Echo Hollow, as a formal designation, has been inactive since 2009, Corin said. His voice was measured, not nervous. Its successor programs operated under different designations and had nominal independence on paper. In practice, the same administrative structure continued, and the containment protocol was part of the original program and was maintained under successor designations. He folded his hands on the table. I want it understood that I opposed several of the decisions made under that protocol. I was in a managerial position that involved significant institutional pressures. Mr. Corin. Hartwell's voice was flat. I've been doing this for 26 years. The institutional pressure framing is for sentencing documents. Right now I need facts. A brief silence. Corin's lawyer made a small sound. Corin looked at Hartwell, then at Reyes, then for the first time at Evelyn. She watched him look at her. She watched him assess and categorize. She could see the assessment happening. Young, female, operational, probably a field asset brought in to evaluate technical claims. Category he put her in was the wrong one. She let him put her there. The containment protocol, he said, returning to Hartwell, processed 3 individuals between 2003 and 2005. 2 have since died of natural causes. The third, Hartwell said, a pause, is currently held at a facility in the northern interior of Alaska, Corin said, outside a town called Chandalar, approximately 60 miles from the nearest maintained road. The facility is operated by a private contractor under a service agreement that has been renewed automatically every 18 months for 20 years. The room was very quiet. The contractor, Hartwell said, company called Meridian Operational Services, registered in Delaware, operational offices in Northern Virginia. They've held the contract since 2004. Evelyn wrote nothing down. She didn't need to, Reyes said, quietly, and the individual currently held at that facility. Corin looked at Reyes. Something crossed his expression, not guilt exactly, but its neighbor. The look of a man who had spent 20 years not examining certain decisions and was now being required to look at them directly. Raymond Blackwell, he said, former defense intelligence analyst. He was processed into the containment protocol in January 2004. The table was very still. Evelyn felt the name land in the room, the way a stone lands in still water, expanding outward, changing the surface of everything it touched, kept her hands flat on the table. She kept her breathing at 10 counts per cycle. Corin hadn't connected the name to the woman sitting across the table from him. Not yet. What are the conditions of his confinement? Hartwell asked. The facility is a managed residential arrangement. He has housing, medical care, regular supervision. Corin spoke more carefully now. He has not been, the protocol was never punitive in the physical sense. He is elderly. He has been cooperative. For 21 years, Reyes said. Corin looked at him, said nothing. What does cooperative look like after 21 years? Reyes continued. His voice was quiet, the particular quiet that came from someone who was angry in a controlled way. Does it look like a man who stopped expecting to be found? Does it look like someone who has spent 2 decades with no access to family, no contact with the outside world, no legal representation, no Mr. Reyes? Corin's lawyer started to interject. He asked a question, Hartwell said to the lawyer. Mr. Corin can answer it. Corin was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. When he looked up, something in his expression had shifted, not broken, but moved. He was told that his family believed he was dead. That was part of the initial protocol. The reasoning was that it reduced certain risks. Escape, motivation, contact attempts. You told a man his family thought he was dead, Reyes said, so he'd be less likely to try to reach them. That is what happened, Corin said. flatly. Without the institutional framing now, just the words. Evelyn looked at the middle distance, somewhere above Corin's right shoulder, and she thought about a 7-year-old girl at a closed casket funeral and a grandmother with a folded flag on her mantle and 21 years of a man alone in a facility in Alaska being told that the people who loved him believed he was gone. She thought about these things in approximately 4 seconds. Then she looked at Corin. He was looking back at her now with the attention of someone who had noticed that the person across the table from him had stopped being background and had become something he needed to think about. "Mr. Corin," she said. It was the first time she'd spoken in the room. His lawyer looked at her. Hartwell looked at her. Reyes looked at the table. Raymond Blackwell taught himself to shoot on a ranch in eastern Montana when he was 11 years old, she said. He served in 2 military branches over 30 years. He wrote a 3-page memorandum in November 2000 and 3 outlining the financial crimes being committed under Echo Hollow and submitted it through appropriate channels. 2 months later, it's processed into your containment protocol, and his family was told he died of cardiac arrest. She held Corin's gaze. His granddaughter grew up believing that. She was 7 years old when she stood at his funeral. Corin went still. His lawyer said, "I'm not sure this line of facility," Evelyn said. "Waypoint 7, Chandalar, Alaska. You said 60 miles from the nearest maintained road. Access as route." A silence. Corin's lawyer put his hand on Corin's arm again. This time, Corin didn't wave it off. He sat very still with the look of a man who had just understood something about the room he was in that he hadn't understood when he'd walked into it. "Mr. Corin," Hartwell said. Her voice had changed slightly. Not softer, but differently weighted. "You said you wanted to cooperate. This is what cooperation looks like." Corin looked at Evelyn. She looked back. "There's a seasonal access road," he said finally. "It's not on any public map. The contractor uses it for supply runs. It comes in from the northeast, off a fire management track that connects to the Dalton Highway approximately 90 miles south of Coldfoot." He paused. "The facility itself is a converted hunting lodge. 4 buildings. The contractor keeps 2 security personnel on site at all times, rotated every 90 days. Current rotation," Evelyn said. "The last rotation was 6 weeks ago. I don't have the specific personnel roster. Armed, standard personal protection. Sidearms. Probably a long gun in the facility. Communication equipment. Satellite uplink. Daily check-in with the contractor's Northern Virginia office at 800 local." He was speaking more quickly now, not because he was nervous, but because the decision to cooperate, once made, apparently had its own momentum. The check-in is missed. The protocol requires a status call within 4 hours and a physical response within 24. She looked at Hartwell. Hartwell gave a small nod. "I'll need the satellite uplink frequency," Evelyn said to Corin, "and whatever you have on the facility's layout. I have a site schematic from the initial construction. 20 years old. I'll take it." Evelyn raised his voice. Low. She looked at him. "The access and extraction planning goes through proper channels," he said carefully. "This becomes a federal matter." "He's been there for 21 years, she said. Her voice was still even. She was proud of how even it was, because underneath it something was pulling hard in a direction she was not going to let it pull. "Every additional day is I understand." Reyes held her gaze. "I understand exactly what it is. I'm telling you that we do this correctly so that nobody has grounds to complicate his release on procedural grounds. We do this right. That means we do it through Hartwell's office." She looked at Hartwell. 48 hours, Hartwell said. "I can have a federal team moving in 48 hours. We'll coordinate with Alaska state authorities, and the contractor will receive notification of their contract termination concurrent with the team's arrival." She paused. "It will be handled properly." He will be handled properly. 48 hours. She thought about what 48 hours was relative to 21 years and tried to find the frame in which it was acceptable and found it, barely, in the understanding that Reyes was right. That anything that cut a corner now could unravel later in a way that cost more than it saved. All right, she said, as on. She sat back. Corin was watching her with the expression of a man assembling a picture he should have assembled earlier. You're his granddaughter, he said. Not a question. She didn't confirm it. I'm sorry, he said. The room was quiet. She looked at him for a moment. He said it with the particular inadequacy of a man who understood that the words were insufficient and was saying them anyway, because there was nothing else to say. She believed it was genuine, which did not make it matter, and did not make it not matter. Write down the satellite frequency, she said, and the access road coordinates. He wrote them down. In the corridor outside the debrief room, Reyes stood with her against the wall while Hartwell's people began the process of securing Corin's formal cooperation agreement. The fluorescent lights in the corridor were better maintained than the ones at Falcon Ridge. They didn't flicker. You held it together in there, Reyes said. I'm fine. I'm not asking if you're fine. I'm observing that you held it together. She looked at the wall across the corridor. Institutional paint. The particular shade of off-white that someone had probably selected from a government-approved palette in 1187, and nobody had revisited since. 48 hours, she said. Yes, I want to be part of the team that goes in. Evelyn, he's going to see a federal response team and not understand what's happening. He's going to need someone he recognizes. She looked at Reyes. He taught me to shoot on a ranch in eastern Montana when I was 7 years old. He's the reason I can do everything I just did on that ridge last night. He needs to see someone he knows. Reyes was quiet for a long moment. I'll make the argument to Hartwell, he said finally. Can't promise the outcome. Make the argument. He nodded once and went back into the debrief room, stood in the corridor, and thought about Alaska. She'd been there once briefly during a training evolution in her second year of fieldwork. Scale of the interior was something that photographs and maps didn't adequately prepare you for the sheer horizontal distance of it, the way the horizon kept receding, particular silence of terrain that had not been built upon or managed or shaped by human use. She thought about a hunting lodge 60 miles from the nearest maintained road. She thought about a man who had been told his family thought he was dead. She thought about her grandmother's flag on the mantel, and about a granola bar she'd eaten without tasting, and about a broken strap on a canvas bag she'd been meaning to fix for 4 months, and about all the ordinary days that had accumulated into 2 years at Falcon Ridge, which had themselves accumulated into the single fact that she was standing in a corridor in Portland, Maine, 48 hours from a resolution she'd spent her adult life not knowing she was working toward. Her phone, the encrypted one, buzzed. Vale. The message read, heard the debrief went well. Also heard about Alaska. I have cold weather gear and nothing else to do. She looked at the message for a moment. Then she typed, you're not part of the federal team. His reply, no, but you might want someone who can drive a truck on an unimproved road in sub-zero temperatures without complaining about it. She almost smiled. It was a near thing. She typed, I'll let you know. She put the phone away. Down the corridor, a door opened and a federal attorney she didn't recognize came out carrying a manila folder and the purposeful stride of someone with somewhere to be. The ordinary machinery of government and law, grinding forward the way it always ground forward slowly, imperfectly, the great deal of friction. But forward. She went to find Hartwell. She had 48 hours and a case to make, and a man in Alaska who didn't know yet that the fiction of his death was about to end. She walked down the corridor with her hands at her sides, and her kit bag over one shoulder in the particular steadiness that came from having nothing left to manage except the next necessary thing. The next necessary thing was Alaska. She focused on that. Hartwell said yes. Not easily, and not without condition, as Evelyn would travel as a federal liaison. Unarmed during the initial approach, with full deference to the team lead on all tactical decisions until the facility was secured. She agreed to every condition without argument, which visibly surprised Hartwell and which Reyes, standing to the side, received with the expression of a man who had expected to have to negotiate longer. She didn't argue because the conditions were reasonable, and because arguing would have cost time she didn't have. Vale drove them to the airport. He'd shown up at the federal building's parking structure at 600 with his truck, his cold weather gear in a bag in the back, and a coffee for each of them in a carrier that he'd clearly stopped for on the way. He handed them out without ceremony and didn't ask how the debrief had gone, which meant Reyes had already told him. Which meant Reyes had decided that Vale's involvement was no longer worth resisting. She took up the coffee, drank it in the truck, without tasting it. At the airport, Vale pulled to the curb and put it in park. The federal team is wheels up in 3 hours, she told him. There's no slot for you on this one. I know. He had both hands on the wheel and was looking at the departure terminal the way people looked at things when they were thinking about something else. I'm not asking for a slot, she waited. I just wanted to say. He stopped, started differently. What you did on that ridge, the shot, the decision to take it that way, not the other way. He looked at her. I've worked with a lot of people. That's not trained. That's character. She looked at him for a moment. You have good eyes, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. She got out of the truck. She got 3 steps toward the terminal and then stopped and turned back. He was still watching through the windshield. She came back to the driver's window. He rolled it down. When this is done, she said, I'm going to need to figure out what comes next. In terms of, she stopped, tried again. My cover at Falcon Ridge is effectively over. The NIGHTWATCH assignment is going to require a formal review. I don't know what the other side of this looks like. He said nothing. Waiting. The annotated map, she said. The ridgeline, the cold weather gear. She looked at him directly. You're good at what you do. I know, he said. That wasn't a compliment. I know that too. He held her gaze. It was an observation. She nodded once, picked up her kit bag. I'll be in touch. She walked into the terminal professionally, which was not to the terminal and didn't look back, which was not because she didn't want to, but because looking back at things that weren't finished yet had never been a productive habit. The federal team was 6 people, 2 DOJ agents from Hartwell's office, a 3-person tactical unit from a federal protective service, and Evelyn as liaison. Team lead was a man named Shepard Compact, professionally humorless, the kind of federal agent who had been doing difficult things in difficult places for long enough that the difficulty had become simply the texture of the job. He looked at Evelyn when they boarded the aircraft with the expression of a man who had been told something he didn't fully accept and was reserving judgment. She was comfortable with reserved judgment. She'd been living inside it for 2 years. The flight to Fairbanks took 5 hours. From Fairbanks, a second aircraft smaller, prop-driven, clearly accustomed to Alaskan interior conditions, took them north for another 90 minutes. The landscape below transitioned in stages from managed wilderness to something that had no interest in being managed by anyone. The scale of it was not something you got used to by seeing it once. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold window and watched the terrain move below and thought about a man who had been in the interior of this for 21 years. They landed on a gravel strip that had been carved out of spruce forest by the kind of effort that suggested someone had needed it badly enough to do a lot of work. A vehicle was waiting, a heavy-duty pickup, government plates, driven by an Alaska State Trooper named Ferraro, who had been briefed only partially, and whose expression indicated he'd learned to operate on partial briefings in this part of the state. 60 miles, Ferraro said, looking at the assembled federal contingent. Roads passable, barely. We had a melt-freeze cycle last week that did some things to the surface. He looked at the sky. Weather's holding, but not for long. You want to be back on this strip by dark. Understood, Shepard said. The 60 miles took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The road was what it was, an unimproved track that had been built with function rather than comfort in mind, and had received maintenance on roughly the same schedule as its designer's conscience. Evelyn sat in the back of the pickup and watched the terrain and ran through scenarios in her head the way she always ran through scenarios, not with anxiety, but with the particular methodical attention of someone building a decision tree. If this, then that, all the way down to the branches that ended in outcomes she didn't prefer, but had to account for. Shepard turned from the front seat. The contractor was notified of contract termination by Hartwell's office at 800 this morning, Alaska time. Standard protocol, they have the legal right to. Did they confirm receipt? She asked. Their Virginia office confirmed. Whether that confirmation has reached the site personnel is another question. And the 800 check-in? Shepard looked at his watch. Was 40 minutes ago. We don't know if the site personnel followed normal protocol or if the Virginia office communication changed their behavior, which meant they were driving toward a situation with a variable they couldn't control. The two security personnel at the facility had been doing a specific job for some portion of the last 21 years. Whether they received that job as legitimate contract security work or as something they understood to be morally complicated was unknown. How they reacted to a federal team arriving to terminate their contract was equally unknown. When we arrive, Shepard said to her, "You stay with the vehicle until the facility is confirmed secure." That was the condition. "Yes," she said. He studied her for a moment. "You have a personal relationship with the individual at this facility." "Yes, that's going to affect you." "I know. I need to know that knowing it is enough." She looked at him. "I've been managing situations that affect me for 9 years. I haven't failed one yet because of it." He turned back to face front without responding, which she took as provisional acceptance. The facility appeared through the trees. Without much warning, the access track bent right around a granite outcropping. And then there it was, 4 low buildings arranged around a central clearing, the main structure a converted hunting lodge, with a covered porch and a satellite dish mounted on the roof. 2 vehicles were parked in front of the main building. Smoke from a chimney, a generator running somewhere, audible over the engine. Looked, from a distance, like the most ordinary thing in the world. Shepard had his team out of the vehicles before the pickup fully stopped. Ferraro stayed with the engines running. Evelyn stood at the side of the pickup and watched Shepard's team move toward the main building in a pattern that was professional without being aggressive, federal identification visible, hands controlled, the kind of approach designed to communicate authority without creating a crisis. The door of the main building opened before they reached the porch. The man who came out was in his 50s, heavy-set, wearing work clothes and a jacket. He was not armed visibly. He looked at the federal team with the expression of someone who had been expecting something like this for longer than today and had decided to be cooperative about it when it arrived. Couldn't hear the conversation from where she stood, but she could read the body language. Shepard, showing identification. The contractor employee, listening. A second person appeared in the doorway behind him, younger, similar posture, similarly unconfrontational. Whatever the Virginia office had communicated to the site had been enough. They were standing down. 3 minutes. Shepard turned and looked at her. He gave a single nod. She moved. The main building smelled of wood smoke and the particular enclosed warmth of a structure that had been heated against serious cold for a long time. The floors were plain wood, worn smooth. There was a kitchen visible through a doorway, a common area with a table and chairs, a wood stove in the corner with a stack of split timber beside it. Everything was functional. Nothing was comfortable. The absence of personal effects, photographs, objects, anything that belonged to a life rather than an arrangement was the most telling thing in the room. A hallway led to the back of the building. One of Shepard's agents came toward her from the hallway. "Second room on the left," he said quietly. He was aware of the vehicle arrival. "He's been informed that federal personnel are on site." A pause. "He hasn't come out." She nodded. She walked down the hallway. The door to the second room on the left was partially open. She stopped outside it. Her hand was on the door frame, and she stood there for a moment that she couldn't have timed if she'd tried, because something had happened to her sense of how long things were taking. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear from somewhere in the room the sound of another person breathing. Pushed the door open. The room was small. A bed, a chair, a window that looked out at the spruce trees, and the gray Alaska light. A table with books on it, actual books, well worn, the spines creased from repeated use. A small wood stove in the corner, this one unlit, the main building's heat reaching here sufficiently. The man in the chair was looking at the window. He was 84 years old. He was thinner than the photograph from 20 years ago, and the sharp edges of him had become sharper in the way that age sometimes made people more themselves rather than less. His hands were on the arms of the chair still, the way she'd seen them still in the photograph. The way she remembered them being still on a cold morning in Montana when he'd waited for her breathing to settle before he let her near the trigger. His hair was white now. It had been gray in the photograph. He turned his head. She had prepared for this. She had run through it in the truck, on the aircraft, on the prop plane, over the interior. She soon had built the scenario in her head with the same careful methodology she applied to everything, and she had thought about what she would say and how she would say it, and how she would manage whatever she felt in the room when she was standing in it. None of that preparation survived the moment she saw his face. His expression moved through three things in rapid succession: confusion, which lasted less than a second; recognition, which arrived and seemed to cost him something physically; and something after that which had no clean name and which she couldn't look at directly, because looking at it directly was not something she was able to do while remaining standing. "Evelyn," he said. His voice was older. The same. She crossed the room, and she was not aware of the crossing, only of the arrival, of her hands on his shoulders and his arms coming up around her, and the chair creaking under the shift of weight, and the wood smoke smell of the room, and the sound he made against her shoulder, which was not a word, and didn't need to be. She held on. She was not crying. She was something that had no name in the vocabulary. She'd built for herself over 29 years of being the person she'd become, something that lived under the floor of the professional structure she'd constructed with such care, and it pressed against that floor now, with a force she hadn't anticipated, and she held on to him and breathed at 10 counts per cycle, and eventually the count got easier. Pulled back first. Looked at her face. "How long?" he asked. His voice was careful in the way that people were careful when they needed the answer to be a specific number and were afraid of what the number would be. "I've known for 4 days," she said, "that you were alive." He looked at her. "I thought." She stopped. We all thought. Grandma kept the flag on the mantel until she stopped again. Something moved across his face. Old pain, the kind that had been there long enough to leave a permanent mark. "Margaret," he said. "She died in 2007, 3 years after." He absorbed this with the particular stillness of a man who had learned to absorb things that had no remedy. He looked at the window. Outside, the Alaska light moved slightly, clouds passing, thin winter sun finding a gap. "And you," he said. "I joined," she said. Eventually, she sat on the edge of the bed across from him, putting them at eye level. "I joined and I was good at it. I was very good at it." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her first target on that Montana morning, assessing, precisely, without performance. "Your hands," he said. She looked at her hands. "Steady," he said. "Yes, you always had that." He looked at her face again. "Even at 7, you could wait. Most people can't wait." She didn't say anything. "How did you find me?" he asked. "It's a long story." She looked at the books on his table. She could see the titles now. History, mostly. Science. A worn atlas that had probably been consulted 10,000 times in 21 years. "I'll tell you all of it, but not here." He nodded slowly. He looked at his hands, then at the room, then at her. "I wrote it down," he said. "Everything I knew. Over the years, from memory, the things I hadn't been able to document in 2003. Every name, every number, every decision I was aware of." He looked toward the bed, and she understood. She pulled the mattress back slightly from the wall, and there, taped to the wooden slat, was a sealed envelope, thick with folded pages. 21 years, he said. "I had time." She took the envelope carefully. "That's for the people who need it," he said. "Not for me." "Yes," she said. "I know." She put the envelope inside her jacket. "Can we leave?" he asked. And underneath the question, The same question that had probably been there for 21 years was something so plain and undefended that she had to look at the window instead of his face for a moment. Yes, she said. Right now. We can leave right now. The return to the airstrip took the same 2 hours and 40 minutes as the approach. Raymond Blackwell sat in the back of the pickup next to his granddaughter and watched the spruce forest give way to the larger scale landscape and didn't speak much. When he did speak, it was in short observations about the terrain, about the quality of the light, about the sounds the engine made when Ferraro took the steeper grades. Practical things. The observations of a man reacquainting himself with a world he'd been separated from and not yet ready to name what that meant. Evelyn let him observe. She didn't try to fill the silences. She'd learned from him that silences were not problems to be solved. At the airstrip, Shepard pulled her aside while the medical personnel Hartwell had arranged checked Raymond over in the back of the pickup. The envelope, Shepard said. Goes to Hartwell, she said. Directly. Yes. He paused. His documentation combined with Greer's materials is going to constitute one of the most significant accountability cases that office has handled in 20 years. Good. Shepard looked at her with the same reserved judgment expression he'd been carrying since Fairbanks. Something in it had shifted slightly, not warmth exactly, but the adjustment of an assessment. You held to the conditions, he said. I said I would. People say things. He looked at the pickup, at the old man being examined by the medic. Not everyone means them under pressure. She had no particular response to this, so she said nothing, which was, she'd found, usually, the correct choice. Formal proceedings took 3 weeks. Raymond Blackwell's medical evaluation in Fairbanks established that he was in improbably good condition for an 84-year-old man who had spent 21 years in controlled isolation. His isolation had at least included regular outdoor time and a diet that the contractor had apparently maintained at a basic standard of adequacy. Psychological evaluation was longer and more complicated, and produced a report that she wasn't permitted to read, which she respected even though she found it difficult. The legal proceedings moved faster than she'd expected. Greer's documentation, Raymond's handwritten account, the detained assets cooperation, and Corin's full cooperation agreement produced a case that the DOJ described in the measured language of official communications as comprehensive. 11 individuals were indicted in the first week, 4 more in the second. The successor programs to Echo Hollow were formally dissolved and their records transferred to a congressional oversight committee that would spend the next several years working through the material. Philip Corin received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. She was told this, and she sat with it for a day and then set it aside, because what happened to Corin was not her business, and spending energy on it would not produce anything useful. What happened to her grandfather was her business. She flew back to see him twice during the 3 weeks, once in Fairbanks, where he was housed in a federal witness protection arrangement while the legal process ran its initial course, and once in Seattle, where he'd been moved after the arrangement was determined to be no longer necessary. He was staying in a hotel that the federal program had arranged, and when she arrived, he was sitting at the window in the same way he'd been sitting at the window in Alaska, watching the city with the systematic attention of a man cataloging everything he'd missed. You look better, she said. He considered the word. Strange. I feel strange. He looked at her. 21 years. The world moved. It moved, she agreed. Some of it moved in the right direction. Some, she confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Then tell me about what you did. The work. All of it. She sat across from him, and she told him. Not everything, some things were classified in ways that would remain classified, but the shape of it. Training, the deployments, the years at Falcon Ridge, undercover. She told him about Maine, about the ridge, about the shot she'd made in the dark at 60 meter ceases in cold northeast wind. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. The bipod mount, he said. Yes. At night. The scope was good. He looked at her with the same expression as Montana. Assessing. Precise. Then, For the first time since the room in Alaska, something crossed his face that was lighter than everything else had been. Again, he said. She almost laughed. It came up and then steadied, and she held it and looked at him. Again, she agreed. The Senate hearing was in April. Chamber was the formal, kind, high ceilings, camera positions, the particular gravity of a room that had held a great deal of national history and knew it. Senator Greer chaired the session, which was appropriate given that he was the reason any of this was happening. The gallery was full. The committee members were largely silent in the way that committee members became silent when the material being presented was serious enough to temporarily override the institutional habit of talking. Raymond Blackwell testified for 4 hours. He sat at the witness table in a suit that his granddaughter had helped him select because he had not owned a suit in 21 years and had no opinion about it, and she had opinions about most things when it mattered. He spoke without notes. He had the material memorized from 21 years of keeping it organized in his head, and he answered every question with the same angular precision that he applied to everything. He was not dramatic. He did not perform outrage or grief. He stated facts in the order that they occurred and allowed the facts to carry their own weight, which they did amply. Evelyn sat in the gallery. She was in civilian clothes, no uniform, no identification of any kind. Nobody in the gallery knew who she was. The woman to her left was a journalist. The man to her right appeared to be a congressional staffer. She sat between them and watched her grandfather testify and kept her hands flat on her thighs and her breathing at 10 counts per cycle. At one point, a senator asked Raymond directly who had ultimately brought this forward. Who had followed the thread far enough to expose what the program had done? Raymond paused. He turned slightly in the direction of the gallery. He couldn't see her, specifically the gallery lighting, and the distance made individual faces difficult from the witness table. But he turned in the right direction. Several people, he said, including people whose names are classified and who prefer it that way. The senator pressed, "Can you characterize these individuals?" Raymond thought about this. Patient, precise. Another pause. The kind of people who can wait longer than the thing they're waiting for expects. Afterward, on the steps of the building, in the thin April sun that was doing its best against a wind that hadn't gotten the memo about spring, she stood with him while his legal escort gave them a few minutes. He was tired. The hearing had been long, and the material had been, regardless of his composure, difficult to spend 4 hours inside. He looked it. He was leaning slightly against the stone railing in a way he hadn't been leaning at the start of the day. "You should eat something," she said. I know." He didn't move toward anything that would involve eating. He looked at the street below, the traffic, the pedestrians, the ordinary constant motion of a city going about its day. "I've been thinking about Montana," he said. She waited. "The ranch property is probably gone. Or sold. Or, I don't know. We could find out." He looked at her. "You'd come." It wasn't quite a question. She thought about Falcon Ridge, which was no longer her posting. She thought about her cover, which was no longer her cover. She thought about the debrief she'd sat through in a DOJ conference room previous week, in which a very senior person had described her night watch assignment as complete and her future assignment as open, which was the bureaucratic way of saying that she had options she hadn't had before. She thought about Vale's text from that morning, which had read, "Heard the testimony went well. Also, I found a property in Montana. Interesting terrain. Thought you'd want to know." She had not responded yet. She thought about all of it, and then she set it aside because this moment was not the moment for logistics. "Yes," she said. "I'd come." He nodded, looked at the street again. There's a lot to... He stopped. The precise language that he applied to everything else had run out somewhere in the gap between 21 years of absence and whatever came next. He looked at his hands. She put her hand on top of his. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "The shot," he said. "The one on the ridge, 60 meters. Moving target, that angle, at night." He shook his head slightly. "I taught you the fundamentals." "I didn't teach you that." "You taught me everything before it," she said. Everything before it is the job. It was quiet. She sat, then he made a sound that she recognized after a second as something she hadn't heard in 22 years, the sound of him laughing. Small, rough, out of practice, but real. You remembered that, he said. I remember everything you taught me. He looked at her. The April light was thin, but it was there, and in it his face was both older than she'd known it, and somehow exactly as she'd kept it. Good, he said. That means I didn't waste my time. She looked at the street. The traffic moved. People walked past at the base of the steps without looking up. The city continued its enormous, indifferent life around this single moment that meant everything to the two people standing in it and nothing to anyone else. That was all right. Some things didn't require witnesses. 3 months later, she drove north out of Missoula on a 2-lane highway with the windows down and the kit bag in the back seat and the rifle case, her grandfather's rifle, which she'd had returned through channels that had taken some navigation in the trunk. The property Vale had found was 60 acres of mixed timber and open ground in the Bitterroot foothills, with a creek and a view east that went uninterrupted for 30 miles on a clear day. The owner had been trying to sell it for 2 years. Price was, as Vale had described in his text, interesting. She hadn't asked him how he'd found it. She was fairly sure she knew. He was meeting her there at noon. Reyes had sent a message that morning that said only Montana. Good choice. She had no idea what her next assignment looked like, or whether Night Watch would call again, or what the shape of the next phase of her life was going to be. She had options she hadn't had before, which was true, and she had a grandfather who was alive and recovering in a way that was imperfect and slow and genuinely real, which was better than any option. She had the notebook in the bag, the one with the range data and the dope and the environmental corrections. On the last page, below the 3 items she'd written after the ridge time, distance. Result, she'd added a 4th line the day after the hearing. Not data, just a name. Raymond H. Blackwell. Active. The highway unspooled ahead of her. The Bitterroot Range rose to the west in that particular way that mountains rose in Montana, as though they'd always been there and always would be, and had no particular interest in being impressive about it. Creek she'd seen in Vale's photographs would be running with snowmelt at this time of year. Eastern View would be what it was, 30 miles of open country under a sky that didn't have to share itself with anything. She drove. She drove with one hand on the wheel and the window down and the spring air coming in. She was not thinking about the next mission or the next assignment or the operational requirements of whatever came after this. She was thinking about 60 acres and a creek and a view east that went on for 30 miles, and about a man who had spent 21 years keeping the truth alive in his own head and on folded paper, hidden behind a mattress, and about the particular discipline it took to keep something alive in the dark when nobody was watching. She thought about all the ordinary days, the granola bars and the flickering lights and the broken strap on a canvas bag that she had, eventually, finally, fixed, and the way ordinary days were where real endurance happened. Not on ridgelines, not in debrief rooms, not in the chambers of federal buildings. The real endurance was the long, quiet middle, where nobody was watching and nothing was dramatic, and the only thing keeping you moving was your own understanding of what the work was for. She knew what the work was for. She turned off the highway onto a gravel road. Ahead, through the trees, the property waited. She had not wasted her time. The ones who are never seen are not always the ones who don't matter. Sometimes they're the ones who matter most, and have learned that lasting longer than the silence requires something the world rarely rewards. The patience to wait and the discipline to act when waiting is no longer enough.